Tourism is big business in Mobile, Alabama. With its warm climate, Mobile has natural appeal to people from colder climates in the north. But it took the brilliant blooms of an ornamental plant to bring Mobile to their attention. During the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, visitors from the north flocked to Mobile for the annual Azalea Trail. The ornamental azaleas that drew them to Mobile had been imported here in the 1920s specifically to attract tourists. They were not native to Mobile. After the 1950s, when azaleas that would grow further north were developed, the Azalea Trail declined, but the legacy of the Azalea Trail lives on in Mobile.
The Azalea Trail was a phenomenon here in Mobile. It really, I think, helped build the tourist industry here in the 20s and 30s. People may have been coming to Mobile before that, but with the Azalea Trail, suddenly we had national attention. People were driving down in their big open Packards, the movie stars. People would line up on the streets to see the movie stars who were driving to Mobile to see the azaleas. The southern evergreen azaleas were famous. People up north couldn't grow those at first. But it wasn't always that way. We've got catalogs from one of the South's most famous nurseries at the time, which was just north of Mobile. It's a big mail order nursery that shipped plants all across the country by train. It was started in the 1850s. And their catalogs from the 1850s, 1870s, 1880s have scores of camellias. They have perhaps 100 or more cultivars of roses. They have 3 or 4 azaleas.
The popularity of azaleas in Mobile can be traced to Sam Lackland, a businessman who had come to Mobile from Charleston, South Carolina. Lackland spearheaded an effort to add Mobile to the annual Azalea Trail that brought visitors to other southeastern cities. He had seen visitors come to Charleston for the annual azalea blooms, and he thought that they would come to Mobile too. In the 1920s, he encouraged people in Mobile to plant imported azaleas.
So Sam talked the Chamber of Commerce into really getting behind this Azalea Trail phenomenon. Azalea trails were stretching, people drove in their cars from Charleston to Savannah to Gainesville, Tallahassee. Mobile was right on the loop, to New Orleans, to Houston. We ought to participate in it. Well, the trouble was you had to get people to grow them. Sam had many devices to get people to grow, but the Chamber of Commerce came up with the idea, shoot, if we can just give people an azalea every time they fill up with gas. So people would, there are press accounts from the 20s where people would go fill up their car and they would get a little tin can with a Southern Indian azalea in it to take home and plant. By the 40s and 50s, there were so many Southern Indian azaleas planted in Mobile that it looked like they had been here forever.
Special events were held during March when the azaleas bloomed. Each year, thousands of runners participate in the Azalea Trail Run. They run along streets that used to have a pink line, leading visitors to areas of the city with brilliant blooms. Serving as hostesses for the Azalea Trail Run, as they do at events around Mobile through the year, are Azalea Trail Maids.
Hello.
The original Azalea Trail Maids served as hostesses to tourists visiting Mobile.
We go through a series of interviews your junior year in high school, and you try out at 2 different levels, and 50 high school seniors from Mobile are chosen to represent Mobile, and we go around and do things for the city, and we do events like this in the city, and we also go out of town for parades and things like that. It's a lot of fun.
The original Azalea Trail Maid competition had such regional appeal that it grew into the America's Junior Miss competition.
But the irony is that the azaleas that made Mobile famous and Alabama famous weren't from Alabama at all. They were imports, beautiful imports from Asia that had originally been grown in Europe in the 18th century in hothouses there. They imported them to Europe from Asia. And then they began to import them to Philadelphia and New York, where they were also grown in hothouses and sold as florist azaleas. We know that by 1840, somebody had decided we ought to try these outside in the deep south, where it's a lot warmer than it is here in Philadelphia. And they started doing that. We know they did it in Charleston and in Charleston, South Carolina, in that area. And suddenly, lo and behold, they realized, gosh, these things grow extraordinarily well in the deep south.
The southern Indian azaleas that were planted in Mobile could not grow in the northern states, but hybrid varieties developed in the 1950s could. When people who had come to see Mobile's azaleas had the opportunity to plant similar ornamentals in their own gardens, the tourist attraction of the annual Azalea Trail began to fade.
So when other cities dropped off this Azalea Trail, Mobile remained sort of a center of azalea activity. We even came to be known as the Azalea City because our azaleas were so famous.
Bellingrath Gardens was a showcase on the Azalea Trail. Owned by Coca-Cola bottlers Walter and Bessie Bellingrath, the land was originally a fishing camp, but Mrs. Bellingrath liked to garden. At Sam Lackland's suggestion, Mrs. Bellingrath directed the planting of azaleas, and the rural retreat became a spectacular tourist attraction. It continues to attract hundreds of thousands of visitors each year.
The gardens that are viewed by the visitors today are roughly around 65 acres. Mr. Bellingrath had purchased about 1,000 acres in this general vicinity, which is still owned by the gardens today, but what you see is 65 acres. We typically have about 200,000 visitors annually that come through the gardens each year. Visitors can go through a wonderful rose garden. It's really interesting that when you look down from a bird's eye view that Walter Bellingrath was one of the first members of the Rotary Club. He was one of the founding members here in Mobile. And so to honor that Rotary Club, if you look down on the pattern of that rose garden, it's the rotary wheel. And then as people move from the conservatories and the rose garden, then they come out into this grand open lawn where there are wonderful live oaks, and then you come to the home. And it's interesting that here you have sort of a very informal sort of pastoral kind of landscape, and then as you move toward the home is very formal, and many of the gardens that have been created around the home you would think are very formalized because they visited a lot of Europe and they saw the very classic shaped formal gardens with clipped hedges and wonderful color and with annuals and perennials and woody shrubs. So a lot of these gardens around the home are exactly the way he designed it years ago. And then he created this big lake called Mirror Lake, and from which to have mass plantings of azaleas.
Sam Lackland was from Charleston, South Carolina, and he really was the one that had the idea that Mobile should have an azalea trail, and the Bellingraths were all for it. They had traveled to Charleston and thought that the climate here is very similar, saw no reason why Mobile couldn't get on the bandwagon with azaleas.
Bellingrath grew up in the 20s, right around the time of the Azalea Trail. I think that's one of the reasons why Bellingrath became the phenomenon it did, was because of this Azalea Trail. The tourists were coming, suddenly they had a huge garden of azaleas to tour when they got down here, and it was fabulous.
We have rather large azaleas on both sides of the trail, and this was basically during that period of time in Mobile's history when landscapes were large, so these azaleas, Southern Indian hybrids, fit into these landscapes real good. Although they don't have color but maybe about 2.5 weeks out of the year, the rest of the year they were tremendous landscape shrubs. You know, they were good green and they were pretty, and they assumed each species kind of variety assumed its own individual shape, and if you let it assume that shape, it usually was in pretty good condition.
And Mrs. Bellingrath is really the reason the gardens are here. Mr. Bellingrath always said if it wasn't for Mrs. Bellingrath, he never would have brought the first flower down here. She had all the ideas and the ambition to make it the gardens that they are. During the Depression years, she had a band of friends that would call her and say, Mrs. Bellingrath, did you know so-and-so's husband's out of work, or so-and-so's husband died, or an orphan needs education? And she had a way of going around Mobile and Baldwin counties and knocking on doors and saying, I've been admiring that azalea, that camellia, whatever shrub she could spot. She had a long tale about how rare and exotic it was. She'd been looking everywhere for one like that. Would they accept, say, $300, $400, $500, $600, $700, $800, depending on the situation, for that shrub? She made the people feel so good that they were helping the gardens that had become so popular, and they were very proud that they were doing that. And of course, she knew that she was putting kids through college, putting food on the table, and then hundreds of dollars back in the days when a loaf of bread was 6 cents.
Mr. Bellingrath was a firm believer in telling guests going through the gardens that if you ever really want to see something different, stop and turn around. So it's a totally different picture from what you saw coming the other way. And he's right. You see a lot of times it's just strolling through a garden means you stop, you turn, you look, and you'll see a lot of things that are here.
There's something so magical to me about a family that builds a garden and is willing to share that garden with a community, and then to set up a foundation so that this garden and their legacy continues by allowing visitors to come through the gardens today. The Bellingraths had impeccable taste, and as we look, I think, toward the future of Bellingrath and what it will hold in the next 20 to 50 to 100 years, one of the things that I think in my position that I have to be thinking about is that we have to honor the past by looking at the future. One of the things that we'll be looking for a long time is how can we maintain the garden as if it was like during Walter and Bessie Bellingrath's time. We need to always make sure that the horticultural standards that we exhibit are the highest, and do the things and do our plantings and create great art here. That's the wonderful part about horticulture. And I mean, a painter, takes a canvas and paints something he's finished, but a gardener does the same thing, but he's using plants. But those plants grow and they change, and so things are constantly changing. So it's always a challenge of trying to make sure that you create art through living things, and that's the fun part of horticulture, and that's the fun part of gardening, I think.
The raw materials for horticultural artists are produced in nurseries, and the Mobile area is home to a thriving nursery industry. As you might expect, azaleas are a major product. Mobile's reputation as the Azalea City is known across the country.
We make a lot more money selling shrubs out of Alabama than we make selling cotton nowadays. It's become a huge industry. A nursery like Flowerwood, there are literally miles of plants. They go on and on and on. And these plants are sold all over the country. Right now, the wholesale nurseries in Alabama many of them have a big regional market. Some have a huge national market. And they're selling plants outside the region to retail nurseries to resell.
Although there are nurseries located across Mobile and Baldwin counties, the town of Sims, northwest of Mobile, is a major center for the nursery industry.
The reason Sims would be such a center for the nursery industry, number one of the wettest spots rainfall-wise in the country. Our soils are good and they percolate well. We have good climate. We don't have real severe freezes and cold weather in the winter.
There's probably 185 nurseries, registered nurseries in the Sims area, the largest being probably 300 acres plus, the smallest being backyard greenhouse. We're 10 acres, so we're kind of in the middle. They go anywhere from 100 to 200 employees to, well, this one is me and Tom and Al.
During the early spring, well, spring to a nurseryman is in January because he's getting ready for the season spring then. During that time of year, there'll be nurserymen from all over the southeast coming to Mobile to buy plants, to look at plants, to decide on what they need for their garden centers or their landscape jobs or for their construction jobs or whatever they're doing.
The Dodd family has been in the nursery business for 3 generations and has a reputation for introducing new plants for use in landscaping.
My grandfather started with some of his relatives, the Welches, and right after World War I, in the nursery business, and in 1921 he started his own nursery and had 9 children, 8 boys and 1 girl. And they continued the tradition. Several of the boys stayed and worked at Tom Dodd Nurseries till the present. Dad retired 2 years ago. About 12 years ago, I decided I wanted to grow native plants. So my wife and I started this little nursery.
With our nursery, we've chosen to do only the Gulf Coast native plants. And we are making selections from plants that are growing that we see, and we choose for darker leaves, darker berries, more vigorous growth, and we choose to do that.
But the main reason to grow native plants and to use native plants is habitat restoration for our local birds and animals and our insects that are local here. The hummingbirds, for instance, have changed their migratory patterns because we've removed a lot of what they fed on. People plant what they call hummingbird plants in a lot of cases to attract hummingbirds, which is a great idea. But the best idea is to get the same plants that were there to start with for the hummingbirds.
When the country was first settled, and the botanists here were exporting our beautiful plants to China, Japan, and England and Germany. That's how they got there in the first place. And at the same time, our ancestors, who were pretty much tied to the sea in the merchant trade, were importing Chinese porcelain and English antiques and Italian architecture, and high society was tied into sort of global stylish influences. And they brought in, I guess, the plants to decorate their homes with.
The imported azaleas that made Mobile famous are produced by the thousands at Tom Dodd Nurseries. But just across the road, Tommy and Thayer Dodd are developing beautiful blooms from azaleas that are native to the Gulf Coast.
One of the main groups we're working on is the native azaleas. We're breeding for big blooms that can stand the heat in the deep south. The gene pool we're reaching into are some of our locals, like Austranum, which is a yellow, the Florida flame azalea, or the pink one, which is the canescens, or the honeysuckle azalea. Those are very heat tolerant and very vigorous growers, and we're breeding them with other native azaleas and other azaleas from other parts of the country to get bigger blooms, but to make them more heat tolerant. American native plants are used more in Great Britain than they are in Alabama for landscaping. One of the biggest selling plants in Japan is the American dogwood. One of the best looking plants in China is a Magnolia grandiflora, the state flower and state tree of Mississippi. Our plants are appreciated much more in the rest of the world than they are here locally. We just do what the Joneses do as far as our landscaping.
Sam Lackland encouraged the people of Mobile to try something new and different in the 1920s, and Mobile's popularity on the Azalea Trail was the result. The Providence Hospital Foundation Festival of Flowers is carrying on the tradition of encouraging people to beautify Mobile with plants in new and different ways. Held each March during the traditional peak of the azalea season, the Festival of Flowers attracts thousands of visitors. Proceeds from the event help support Providence Hospital in Mobile.
One of our goals is when they enter the show, we want them to say, wow. And we have several components. We have the floral showcase component, where we actually have professional florists that are given a theme, and then they do a floral interpretation of the theme. And that's always a big hit with all the spectators coming to the show. And once you go through that particular venue, you would enter what we call our Grand Marquee tent, which is a tent that houses all of our life-size garden and landscape designs. They develop a landscape theme, or landscape based on a theme of their choosing. And that tends to work out really well. They're from serious to funny to whimsical to very formal, some informal. And it's really the thing that's probably one of the most popular reasons that people come to the show. They like to see the garden. One of the things that we stress in the Grand Marquee with our landscape designers and our landscape architects is that we use material, plants, foliage, flowers, any of the materials that they use. One of the criteria is that will it grow in our environment in Alabama, lower Alabama? Will it thrive? Are the materials accessible? Are they materials that can be bought locally? And one of the things that makes it interesting for our spectators is that they can actually relate to what's been produced here in the Grand Marquee because they've either seen it or they know they can get it. And it inspires people to do things in their own yard. They may hire somebody to do it, or they may be inspired to do it themselves. That's what we really want people to take away from here, is to be inspired.
A dazzling display of cut flowers imported from around the world is another feature of the Festival of Flowers.
We just wanted to educate the public about cut flowers. And one of the ways that we decided to try and do that was to have an exhibit that would showcase flowers from all over the world. You know, the floral industry is huge worldwide. There are flowers grown all over the world. They're shipped. They have distributors, and they're shipped out overnight, and they're in your florist the next day. And there's so many things available that the public may or may not be aware of. And we're trying to get the public to have a real appreciation for the cut flower and what it can do.
The Festival of Flowers has joined with the celebration of Mobile's tricentennial to promote a beautification project with an even broader scope than Sam Lackland's Azalea Trail.
Our goal is to have individuals, businesses, neighborhoods to look at what grows well in our environment and landscape their businesses, their homes, their neighborhoods in such a way that we have things blooming all year long.
The Festival of Flowers, the Providence Festival of Flowers, started up 5-6 years ago. And I think it was sort of following in the footsteps of this Azalea Trail phenomenon. People, even if people weren't coming to see the azaleas, people realized, gosh, Mobile is such a great place to garden. We've got 12 months of gardening weather here from January through December. Why don't we take advantage of it? The Providence Festival of Flowers sort of began with that idea, and itself has grown to take over many of the functions, I think, that were part of the Azalea Trail originally.